The summer of 1971 pressed down on southern Louisiana like a hot iron on wet cloth, and the land beneath Clara Beaumont's boots showed every scar of it. She stood at the edge of what the locals called the Grice 50-50 acres of pale cracked earth that stretched toward a line of exhausted cypress trees, their roots gripping soil so compacted and sour that even weeds had given up the argument. The ground beneath her feet had fractured into a mosaic of irregular polygons, each plate curling at its edges like old paint peeling from a forgotten wall. In the center of the largest depression, where a pond had once held water, the earth had pulled away from itself in long, curving fissures. She could see, if she looked carefully, the faint tide marks on the cypress trunks, dark stains 2 feet above the current soil line, evidence of water that had once been here and had decided over the slow years that it had better places to be. Clara was 23 years old. Her hair was pulled back with a strip of cotton torn from an old shirt, and her boots, the good ones, the ones she had bought with her own money before the marriage, were already caked with the pale clay dust that seemed to rise from nothing and settle on everything within a quarter mile of this place. She carried a cashier's check in the front pocket of her dress, folded twice the paper damp at the corners from where her fingers had pressed against it during the drive. The amount on that check represented the sum total of what Clara Beaumont owned in this world, $2,400 drawn from a joint savings account that had ceased to be joint as of 8 days ago, when a judge in Terrebonne Parish had signed his name across the bottom of a document and handed her back to herself. The marriage to Randall Dempsey had lasted 4 years. The farm, the good farm, 200 acres of dark, loamy bottomland that Randall's father had built from a single mule and a borrowed plow over 30 years, had stayed with Randall. This was the way of things. The machinery stayed. The grain silos stayed. The barn with the new tin roof and the well that had never once run dry in living memory, all of it stayed. The judge had not been unkind. He had simply been accurate about the law as it stood in Louisiana in the year 1971, and the law did not incline itself toward 23-year-old women with no deed in their name. What Clara had taken with her besides the boots and the cashier's check was a wooden box roughly the size of a small suitcase. It was made from old cypress, the wood darkened with age and oil from decades of handling, and it latched with a simple brass hook that had gone green at the edges. No one in the courthouse that day had paid it any attention. The paralegal processing the paperwork had glanced at it and then away, her eyes moving on to the next form. Randall's attorney had not mentioned it. Randall himself had not looked at it. They had all assumed it held sentimental trinkets, old photographs perhaps, or a woman's jewelry wrapped in cloth. They had assumed wrong. Inside that cypress box, stacked in neat columns and held flat by a length of waxed twine, were 24 notebooks. They were not identical. They ranged from small pocket ledgers with marbled covers to larger composition books with spines repaired by strips of electrical tape, but they shared a common quality that made them collectively the most valuable thing Clara had ever touched. Each one was filled front to back in the handwriting of her grandfather, Earl Beaumont. The script was spidery and precise, slanting hard to the right, as though always leaning into a wind, and it recorded across a span of 31 years, not the profits and losses of a farm, but the living behavior of the land itself. Earl Beaumont had been the peculiar farmer of Lafourche Parish. His neighbors had tolerated him with the particular patience that farming communities reserve for the harmlessly unusual. He did not attend the agricultural extension meetings. He did not use the fertilizer schedules distributed by the co-op. His fields were not arranged in the efficient parallel rows that made proper use of modern equipment, but in gentle curves that followed the natural contours of the ground in ways that struck other farmers as wasteful and vaguely eccentric. His yields, however, were consistent in ways that could not be explained by the conventional logic of the men who questioned his methods, and so they had mostly left him alone, filing him away in the category of lucky rather than right. Clara had understood him from the time she was 7 years old, when he had taken her hand on a summer afternoon and walked her to the edge of one of his fields after a hard rain. He had crouched down beside her, his knees popping, and pointed to the trunk of a hackberry tree at the field's edge. There were 2 lines of discoloration on the bark, horizontal bands of darker wood, where water had sat and receded over years. That bottom line, he had said, his voice low and without drama, the voice of a man stating a fact he found simply interesting. That's where the water sat after the hard rain of 1961. That top line is 1953, the year your mother was born, as it happens, which is how I remember it. He had looked at her, gauging whether she was following. Most men look at that tree and see a tree. What do you see? She had thought about it. A record, she had said finally. He had nodded once slowly, the way he always nodded when something satisfied him. Everything out here keeps its own records, Clara. Your job is to learn how to read them. He had died in the winter of 1969, leaving Clara the cypress box, and without explanation or ceremony, the 1952 pickup truck that had served as his primary farm vehicle for 2 decades. The truck she had driven for a year and a half before the marriage, and then for another 2 years alongside Randall, who had never understood why she kept it when the farm had 3 newer vehicles. The notebook she had read and reread, not as instructions, but as correspondence letters, from a mind that thought about the world in ways she recognized as her own, written before she had the words to name what she was thinking. It was the notebooks that had brought her to the Grice 50. Harlan Grice was a man whose face recorded every year of bad luck in lines that ran deep and parallel across his forehead, and he had been trying to sell this land for 3 years without success. He had tried cotton on it, which had grown thin and boled poorly. He had tried soybeans, which had drowned in the shallow depressions where water collected and then baked in the clay when the summer heat arrived. The land had a drainage problem that was not simply a matter of digging a ditch. It was a matter of fundamental soil structure, layers of impermeable clay interspersed with pockets of sand that held water in the wrong places at the wrong times, creating a cycle of brief saturation followed by brutal desiccation that no annual row crop could tolerate. Harlan knew the problem, but not the solution, and after a decade of losing money on land he had inherited from an uncle who had also lost money on it, he had arrived at the position of simply wanting someone else to carry the weight. He met Claire at the property line on a Tuesday morning, pulling up in his rusted truck and climbing out with the loose-limbed movements of a man who has been tired for a long time. He looked at her, 23 years old, her boots already dusty, a wooden box sitting on the passenger seat of the truck behind her, and his expression moved through several things before settling on something between relief and guilt. "You sure about this, Miss Beaumont?" The question came out before he could stop it. He gestured at the cracked earth, the desiccated basin, the cypress trees that looked as though they had simply decided to stop trying. "I've had this land a good long time, and I can tell you straight, ain't nothing ever grew here but heartache. This ground don't forgive." Clara looked at the land. She looked at the watermarks on the cypress trunks. She looked at the shape of the central basin, the way it curved, the precise geometry of how it had been formed by decades of water moving in and then retreating. She looked at the distance from the bayou that ran along the eastern boundary and the slope of the ground between the bayou and the lowest point of the depression, and she calculated in her head what Earl had taught her to calculate: how much water could flow by gravity, how much would need to be pumped, what the lift distance would be, what a used pump with adequate capacity would cost at the equipment auction in Thibodaux. She reached into her dress pocket, unfolded the cashier's check, and held it out to him without a word. Harlan took it with a speed that confirmed everything. He looked at the amount, looked at her once more, a quick, uncomfortable look that was not quite apology, but contained some of the same elements. And then he pulled a folded document from his shirt pocket and spread it on the hood of his truck. The deed transfer was simple, a single page. He signed it. She signed it. No attorney, no witness beyond the open sky and the cracked ground beneath them. When it was done, he folded his copy carefully and put it in his glove compartment, and he climbed back into his truck without looking at the land again. As he pulled away down the parish road, kicking a rooster tail of pale dust, Clara heard it clearly through her open truck window, a short, dry laugh that was not directed at anything in particular, but carried with it the unmistakable tone of a man who believed completely and without reservation that he had just transferred a curse to someone foolish enough to accept it. She did not watch him go. She crouched down instead, right where she stood, and pressed both palms flat against the cracked earth. The surface was hot from the morning sun and rough as old concrete, but beneath the immediate dryness, she could feel, or imagined she could feel, though she was never entirely certain where observation ended and intuition began, the faint, deep coolness of the water table that had not entirely abandoned this place, only retreated. The soil that crumbled from the edges of the nearest crack was pale on its outer surface, but darker inside the color of river sediment rather than mineral clay. She squeezed a piece between her fingers and brought her hand up to her nose. Rich organic decay. Not dead soil, sleeping soil. She picked up the full piece of broken crust, turned it in her hand, then set it back precisely where it had been, as though returning something borrowed. The town of Petit Crochet got the news before sundown. This was not remarkable. In the farming communities of southern Louisiana in the early 1970s, information about land transactions traveled faster than rain and with more certainty. The network was informal but comprehensive. It ran through the feed store on Highway 24, through the co-op office on Magnolia Street, through the parking lots of 3 Baptist churches, through the Tuesday coffee at Delphine's Diner, where the serious farmer sat from 6 in the morning until the conversation ran out, which was rarely before 9. By the time Clara drove back to her rented room above Madame Arsenault's hardware store, with the deed folded in her dress pocket and the cypress box on the seat beside her, the story was already in circulation. The young Beaumont woman, Earl's granddaughter, the one who'd married Randall Dempsey, and come out of it with nothing to show, had spent her last dollar on the Grice 50. The assessments varied in their language, but not in their conclusion. At the feed store, a man named Tolliver Brecht, who farmed 800 acres of rice to the north and considered himself a reliable judge of agricultural decisions, shook his head over a bag of mineral supplement and said it plainly. That ground won't produce. Harlan tried everything sensible on it for 10 years. What's a girl going to do that Harlan Grice couldn't? At Delphine's the following morning, the conversation was longer but arrived at the same place. The soil was wrong. The drainage was wrong. The location was marginal. The price Clara had paid every dollar she owned was not a calculated risk. It was a desperate one, and desperate decisions made by people with no resources left tended to end in one way. There was pity in these assessments, but it was the pity of certainty rather than the pity of concern. These were not men who doubted their conclusions. They had seen bad land before. They knew what it looked like, what it grew, and what became of the people who threw their savings at it. The consensus that Clara Beaumont would be broke by the following spring carried the same weight in the coffee shops and the co-op waiting room as the consensus about the upcoming weather, something known merely waiting to be confirmed. Calhoun Pritt did not participate in these discussions, which was itself a kind of statement in a community where silence on a local matter was read as carefully as words. Calhoun was 61 years old, had farmed 220 acres on the west side of the parish since his father had handed him the keys at age 22, and was regarded quietly without fanfare as the man whose opinion carried the most weight precisely because he offered it the least. He had known Earl Beaumont. He had watched Earl do things with his land that the textbooks couldn't explain and that the results couldn't argue with. When someone at the co-op mentioned the Beaumont girl and the Grice 50 in the same breath and turned to Calhoun for his reading, Calhoun took a slow sip of his coffee, looked out the window toward the south, and said nothing. Then he put his cup down and left. The co-op office smelled of fertilizer dust and old paper, and Douglas Warren had worked in it for so long that he had stopped noticing either. He was 52, thickly built in a way that suggested former physical capability rather than current indulgence, with close-cropped gray hair, and the hands of a man who had once farmed himself before deciding that the managing of other farmers' accounts was more stable work. He had been the director of the Petit Crochet Agricultural Cooperative for 19 years. He had extended credit to 3 generations of local families. He had denied credit with equal measure and without personal pleasure to approximately 40 applicants over those same years, and in every case his denials had been based on the same simple calculus: probability of return against risk of loss, measured against the established practices of successful local agriculture. Clara arrived at his office on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the land purchase, wearing a clean dress and carrying no documents other than the deed to the Grice 50. She had requested the appointment by phone and had been given a 15-minute slot at 9 in the morning. She arrived at 8:55 and sat in the waiting area without fidgeting, which Warren noticed from his office window before she was shown in. She was brief. She stated what she wanted: a credit line for seed rice sufficient for 20 acres, and then she stated why. She explained the rice planting, the flooding schedule, the post-harvest retention of water in the fields. She explained the introduction of crawfish broodstock into the stubble-flooded fields, the natural feed cycle of decaying rice material, the overwintering harvest timeline. She explained that her costs after the first year would be minimal because the system was self-sustaining. The rice enriched the crawfish. The crawfish enriched the soil for the following rice. Two harvests from one planting, one water source, one field. Warren listened with the expression of a man who has heard many unusual things over 19 years and has learned to reserve his response until the speaking is finished. When Clara stopped, he was quiet for a moment, his fingers laced on the desk in front of him. Your grandfather was Earl Beaumont. It was not a question. Yes, sir. Earl was a particular kind of farmer. He chose the word carefully. He had his methods. A pause. Results, too, I'll grant that. But Earl had decades on his land. He understood it. Another pause longer. You have 50 acres of gumbo crack that Harlan Grice couldn't make productive in 10 years of trying, and you're proposing to flood it and raise bugs in the rice stubble. He did not say crawfish. The word he chose was deliberate, and Clara heard the deliberateness. I've been in this office a long time. I know what productive agriculture looks like in this parish, and I know what it doesn't look like. The soil acidity on the Grice parcel runs too high for good rice germination. The drainage issues would cause root rot before the crop matures. The crawfish, he corrected himself barely without acknowledgement, needs specific water chemistry and temperature ranges that a flooded rice field doesn't reliably produce. I can't extend co-op credit for a plan that doesn't have a reasonable probability of return. That wouldn't be fair to the other members. He was polite. He was thorough. He was in the way that institutions are when they decline regretful without being apologetic. Clara looked at him across the desk for a moment after he finished long enough that he shifted slightly in his chair. Thank you for your time, Mr. Warren. She left without argument, which he had not expected. The bank on Magnolia Street gave her 20 minutes and a more elaborate version of the same answer. No collateral beyond the land itself, which they valued based on comparable sales and soil assessment at approximately 60% of what she had paid for it. No farming history in her name, no cosigner. The loan officer was younger than Warren and less experienced, which made him more nervous about the silence that followed his denial, but the answer itself was identical. Clara drove back to the Grice 50 that afternoon and walked the perimeter of the largest pond basin for 2 hours. She was not despairing. She was calculating. Earl had taught her that every system had constraints, and that constraints were not obstacles to a plan, but data points that refined it. The constraint now was simple. She had no access to credit, which meant she had no buffer, which meant every dollar spent had to return at least $1.50 before the next planting season, or the whole structure would collapse. It was a thin margin. It was workable. What it required was a sacrifice she had been avoiding since the morning she had left Randall Dempsey's farm. The 1952 pickup truck sat in the gravel lot behind Madame Arsenault's building and had accumulated 400 miles since Earl's death, driven by Clara first out of practicality and then out of something she was reluctant to name directly. The truck smelled of Earl of Diesel and dried mud, and the particular combination of machine oil and pipe tobacco that had been so constant in her childhood that she had stopped smelling it until it was gone, and then had never stopped. The bench seat had a tear on the driver's side that Earl had repaired with a piece of black electrical tape, which had itself begun to peel at one corner. She had never fixed it further. The radio worked on AM only and pulled in 2 stations clearly, one of which played country music and one of which played farm reports in a monotone that Earl had preferred to silence on long drives. She sat in the cab for 20 minutes with the engine off her hands in her lap before she got out and went inside to call the equipment dealer in Thibodaux, who had left his card at the feed store 3 months back, saying he was always looking for vintage vehicles in working condition. He came the next morning and gave her $850, which was fair for the truck and slightly below fair for what it represented. She did not negotiate. She took the cash, watched him drive it down the street, and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment in the particular silence of a decision that cannot be undone. That night, she spread all 24 notebooks across the floor of her rented room. The bare bulb overhead cast a yellow light that softened the spidery handwriting, but did not make it harder to read. She had memorized the cadences of Earl's script so completely that she could parse it at speed. She was not searching for a formula. She had never used the notebooks that way as a recipe to be followed. She was searching for something harder to name the thing Earl had known about this specific type of ground, the specific type of failure that the Grice 50 represented, and what, if anything, he had seen as its possibility. She found it in the fourth notebook from the left, the one with the cracked brown cover that she had always thought of as the drought journal, because the entries from 1934 ran for 60 pages without a single mention of rain. He had written in August of that year, during the worst of it, "The ponds are cracked. The Melanson boys have sold their cattle at half price and gone to work in the city. Bertrand Foray is talking about walking away from his bottomland. They look at the baked mud and see an empty. I look at the shape of the basin and see a promise. A vessel is only a vessel. Its purpose is to be filled. The water will return. The question is, what will you have waiting for it when it does?" She had read that passage a dozen times before. She read it again and then turned the page. She had not in previous readings continued past that entry. Now she did. 3 pages later, Earl had written a single paragraph that she had simply never reached. "The man who comes to buy broken land is not foolish. He is early. The land is not broken, it is between conversations. The man who sells it cannot hear the next thing it intends to say. The buyer, if he is patient and quiet enough, will be the first one to hear it." She sat with that for a long time, the notebook open in her lap. What Earl had understood, and what Clara had absorbed so gradually over the summers of her childhood, that she could no longer separate it from her own thinking, was that the land the Grice 50 resembled most closely was not failed farmland. It was pre-farmland. The shallow basins, the impermeable clay substrate, the proximity to the bayou, the natural accumulation of organic material at the lowest points. These were not the symptoms of ruined earth. They were the features of land that had been used incorrectly. The local agricultural tradition had tried to make it into something it was not well-drained row crop acreage, and had failed, and from that failure concluded that the land itself was the problem. Clara had concluded something different the first time she had walked the boundary of the Grice 50, before she had even made the appointment to see Harlan Grice, before she had unfolded the cashier's check. She had looked at those shallow basins and seen so clearly that she was almost startled by its obviousness. Rice paddies, not paddies that needed to be constructed, paddies that the land had already shaped for itself over decades of flooding and drying, sculpting the terrain into exactly the gentle, bowl-shaped depressions that rice required. The impermeable clay substrate, which had been the undoing of every row crop attempted on this land, was precisely what a flooded rice field needed to hold water. Harlan Grice had been fighting the clay. Clara intended to hire it. The rice was one act. The second act was what made the system self-sustaining. In southern Louisiana, rice fields were treated as single-purpose instruments. You grew the rice in summer, you harvested in late August or September. You drained the fields and either burned the stubble or plowed it under, and then the land sat empty through the winter. It was the winter that Earl's journals had spent the most time examining, not as a dormant period, but as a missed opportunity. The rotting rice stubble left in a flooded field created, according to Earl's careful observations, over 31 years, exactly the food source and habitat conditions that crawfish needed to grow to premium size. The crawfish weren't a separate enterprise requiring separate infrastructure. They were the second half of a single conversation that the land was already having with itself. The rice fed the crawfish. The crawfish, through their burrowing and their waste, and the fertility cycle their bodies created, enriched the soil for the following season's rice. It was closed. It was elegant. It required no external inputs beyond the initial stocking of brood crawfish and the seed rice for the first planting. After that, the system generated its own fuel. She had tried to explain this to Douglas Warren. She understood, sitting on the floor of her rented room with Earl's notebooks around her, why he had not been able to hear it. He was not stupid. He was fluent in one language, the language of conventional Louisiana agriculture, and what she was describing was written in a language his 19 years in that office had given him no occasion to learn. The problem was that his inability to hear it did not change what she needed to do. She counted what remained after the truck sale, and the brood stock she had already priced. She had enough for a second-hand water pump with sufficient capacity to draw from the bayou. Enough pipe to connect it, and enough seed rice if she bought it directly from a farmer in Evangeline Parish who sold surplus rather than through the co-op for 12 acres instead of 20. 12 was not the number she had planned. 12 was the number she had. She wrote it down in a fresh notebook, not Earl's handwriting, but her own, larger and less elegant slanting left rather than right. She wrote the acreage, the planting schedule, the flooding timeline, the estimated crawfish stocking density per acre, the projected harvest window. She wrote it not because she needed to see it to believe it, but because Earl had taught her that a plan not written down was a hope, and she needed this to be a plan. She bought the pump on a Saturday from a farm equipment auction in Thibodaux, bidding against two other men who lost interest when the price passed the point of easy profit. The pump was a 1964 model diesel-powered with a cracked housing on one side that she repaired herself over 2 evenings with epoxy and a piece of sheet metal from the hardware store downstairs. She bought the pipe from a salvage yard outside Homa, 60 feet of 4-inch steel pipe that had been pulled from a demolished irrigation system, and she drove it back balanced on the roof of her borrowed car. She had borrowed a car from Madame Arsenault's son, a kindness offered without questions, strapped down with lengths of baling twine. The first morning she fired the pump, it was early enough that the herons had not yet left the bayou. The diesel engine coughed twice through a column of black smoke into the still air, and then settled into a steady clattering rhythm. The sound carried across the flat ground in every direction, and there was nothing on the Grice 50 to absorb it or soften it. No barns, no tree lines, close enough to matter nothing but the pale, cracked earth and the distant cypress at the western edge. Anyone within a quarter-mile heard it. The pipe shuddered. Then with a sound like a large collective exhale, the water came. It ran dark at first, dark with pipe rust and bayou sediment, and then it clarified as Clara watched it spread across the floor of the central basin, finding the low points first filling the deepest cracks before it rose to meet the shallower ones. She stood at the edge of the basin and watched the water move, and felt something that was not quite joy and not quite relief, but was adjacent to both, something closer to recognition. The feeling of watching a prediction confirm itself in real time. The feeling of having heard a thing correctly. The water spread. On the parish road 50 yards away, a pickup truck slowed almost to a stop. She heard it without looking, heard the engine drop to an idle, heard the pause that meant someone behind the wheel was studying the scene, heard the decision to continue made when the engine picked back up and the truck moved on. She did not turn around. She was watching the water. By the time the morning had fully arrived, the center of the basin held a shallow sheet of bayou water, no more than 2 inches deep, reflecting the sky in a long silver oval. The cracks around its edges were still visible above the waterline, but at the waterline itself, the clay had already begun to soften and seal the dried earth, drinking with an urgency that was almost audible. In the places where the water had reached and receded slightly, the surface had gone from pale bone to deep brown, the color returning like blood to a cold hand. Clara walked the perimeter of the basin as the sun rose fully over the cypress line, her boots leaving prints in the mud at the water's edge that had not existed 20 minutes ago. She was calculating pump hours evaporation rates, the number of days before the water level would be sufficient for seed broadcasting. She was thinking about the crawfish broodstock she had reserved with a trapper down the basin, the call she needed to make to the Evangeline Parish farmer about the rice seed, the order of operations for the levee repair work that needed to happen before she could hold a consistent water level across the smaller secondary ponds. She was also thinking, though, she would not have described it this way to anyone about Earl. She had not cried when he died. She had sat with his body for an hour in the front room of his house, holding his left hand, which was already cooling, but retained its shape, the specific shape of a hand that had spent 60 years in physical conversation with the ground, and she had felt not grief, but the deep particular silence of a frequency going off the air. He had taught her everything she knew that mattered, and he had not done it by talking. He had done it by showing her how to look, by standing beside her and asking not what she saw, but what she thought about what she saw, and then waiting, genuinely waiting for her answer, without offering his own first. He had treated her mind as though it was already capable of arriving at the right conclusion if given sufficient time and attention, which was the most significant pedagogical gift he could have offered a child who had been told in various ways that her conclusions were beside the point. She had not cried for him until she sold his truck. She stood at the edge of the first filling basin on the Grice 50, and the sun was warm on her face, and the pump ran its steady diesel clatter behind her, and she thought of the line from the 1934 notebook, "What will you have waiting for it when it does?" And the answer she had brought to this land was everything Earl had given her, every observation and principle, in stubborn, quiet, practical conviction about how the earth actually worked, as opposed to how it was conventionally managed. The water was rising, not fast, not dramatically. 2 inches in the basin, moving toward 3, the oval of reflected sky growing by centimeters rather than feet. By any conventional measure, it was an underwhelming sight, a middle-aged pump dumping bayou water into a cracked clay bowl, while the woman who had bought the bowl stood watching it fill. Harlan Grice was probably at breakfast by now, counting himself fortunate. Douglas Warren was certainly at his desk managing the accounts of men who borrowed money in conventional ways and spent it on conventional things, and produced results that were legible to 19 years of institutional experience. The men at the co-op were drinking their coffee and arriving collectively at the same comfortable conclusion they had been arriving at for the past 2 weeks. The Beaumont girl would learn what everyone already knew, and the learning would be expensive, and perhaps afterward she would find something more appropriate to do with whatever she managed to salvage. Clara Beaumont crouched down at the water's edge and pressed 2 fingers into the softening mud. She brought them up and looked at the color, not pale clay anymore, but something darker, beginning to be something else. She wiped her fingers on her work pants, stood and turned back toward the pump. There was a secondary levee on the eastern pond that needed shoring up before she could flood it. She had 4 hours of daylight left. She got to work. The first winter came in gray and indifferent, and Clara worked through it the way she worked through everything, without announcement, without an audience, without any particular regard for whether the conditions were favorable. The secondary levee on the eastern pond had taken 11 days to shore up properly, which was 10 days longer than she had estimated, because the soil 3 feet below the surface was not the dense clay she had expected, but a layer of decomposed organic material, soft as wet bread, that would not hold a packed earthen wall without a core of something more substantial. She solved it with cypress stakes driven at 18-inch intervals along the levee line, filling between them with a clay and shredded grass mixture she mixed by foot in a shallow pit she dug for the purpose. Her boots rotted through at the left toe by mid-October. She wrapped the gap with electrical tape, the same variety Earl had used on the bench seat of the truck, and kept working. By November, she had 3 of the 5 natural basins holding water at a consistent level. The rice had gone in during late July, not broadcast from a plane in the manner of the larger operations, but hand-cast by Clara herself, wading through knee-deep water in long diagonal passes across each flooded pond, the seeds scattering from her cupped palms in arcs that she had practiced until the distribution was even enough to satisfy her. The germination had been uneven on the first pond, stronger on the second, nearly uniform on the third, which told her something about the variation in soil chemistry across the property that she recorded in her own notebook, with the same precision Earl had recorded rainfall. The rice grew thin in places. She had known it would. That first season the soil was not yet what it needed to become. Still too acidic, still too compacted in its lower layers, still working out what it was supposed to be now that someone was paying attention to it. The plants that did establish were vigorous, which mattered more than density in a first-year system. They put down roots into the clay substrate and began the slow process of changing it. When Clara pulled a plant by the roots in late August to examine the root structure, she found something Earl had described in the 7th notebook, a network of fine filaments extending 6 inches beyond the main root mass. The plant's attempt to colonize the surrounding soil with microbial partnerships that would over successive seasons begin breaking down the clay particles into something a crop could use. The plant was not just growing, it was rebuilding the ground it grew in. The harvest in September was modest. She had expected half the parish average and received slightly less 63% of what a well-established rice field would have produced, which translated to a check from the Evangeline grain buyer that covered her pump fuel for the year with $40 remaining. The men at the co-op knew the number before she did. Tolliver Breck mentioned it at Delphine's with the careful neutrality of a man confirming a prediction he takes no pleasure in, though his posture suggested otherwise. What they did not know was what she put into the water on the 1st of October. The crawfish brood stock came from a trapper named Sivert Falk, who worked the lower basin 40 miles south. A lean, sun-darkened man of few words who had been doing what Clara was attempting in a less systematic form for 15 years. She had found him through a reference in Earl's journals, a single line in the 12th notebook that read, "Spoke with a trapper named of Falk, who says the crawfish triple in size when they eat rice rather than common mudgrass. Worth watching." She had driven down to meet him in August, sitting on an overturned bucket at the edge of his operation, while he ran traps and answered her questions with the economy of a man who did not believe in wasting words. When she left, she had a purchase agreement for 200 pounds of broodstock, a handshake, and a piece of information that proved more valuable than either the specific water depth at which crawfish preferred to burrow, which was slightly shallower than the depth at which rice grew best, which meant the transition from rice field to crawfish habitat needed to drop the water level by approximately 4 inches after harvest. 4 inches, she wrote it down. She stocked the 3 flooded ponds in early October, walking the levees in the gray morning light with buckets of broodstock, releasing them at intervals along the water's edge. The crawfish entered the water with a collective sound like thrown gravel and disappeared immediately into the stubble of the harvested rice, which stood 6 inches above the waterline, in broken brown clusters already softening. The water was cooling. The conditions were close to what Earl's notebooks described and what Sievert Falk had confirmed from his own observation. Clara recorded everything: water temperature, stocking density per acre, the date, the weather, in the same notebook where she had written the planning schedule 10 months earlier. Then she waited. The waiting was not passive. She repaired the pump housing where the epoxy had cracked in the November cold. She rebuilt the fourth pond's levee system from scratch after discovering that the original earthen walls had been constructed over a layer of porous sandstone that was slowly siphoning water out of the pond at a rate that would have drained it by spring. She planted a windbreak of native vegetation along the northern boundary, following a technique Earl had described for reducing surface evaporation in shallow water systems. She drove to the agricultural library at Nichols State in Thibodaux on 3 separate Saturdays and read everything they had on crawfish biology, rice, soil chemistry, and integrated aquaculture, emerging each time with notes that she compared against Earl's journals to distinguish between what the academic literature agreed with him on and where her grandfather's empirical observations had arrived at conclusions the textbooks had not yet caught up to. The traps went in during December. She had built them herself from wire mesh and wooden frames, cylindrical, with a funnel entrance at one end, based on a design she had seen in a 1967 paper on commercial crawfish harvesting in the Atchafalaya Basin. She set 40 traps across the 3 ponds, baiting them with fish carcasses she bought cheaply from a processor in Homa, who was grateful for anyone willing to take the byproduct off his hands. The first morning she ran the trap line, it was still dark when she pushed the pirogue away from the bank. She had borrowed the pirogue from Calhoun Pritt, who had offered it 2 weeks earlier without explanation. He had simply appeared one afternoon at the property line with the flat-bottom boat on a trailer behind his truck, said that he had a second one and didn't need both, and driven away before she could formulate a response. She had told herself she would return it in the spring. She had not examined the gesture too closely because examining it would have required acknowledging how much it meant to her to have even one person act as though her plan was worth enabling rather than merely surviving. The fog sat on the water in layers, the lower layer, still the upper layer, drifting in slow currents that had nothing to do with the wind. The pirogue moved through it with a sound like fabric on fabric, the paddle lifting and pulling, her rhythm practiced enough now that it required no concentration. The traps were visible from 20 feet as pale geometric shapes just below the waterline, their marker lines trailing upward to small wooden floats she had painted orange. The first trap surfaced with the lightness of an empty glove. She did not register it immediately. She cleared the funnel, checked the bait, reset, the trap moved on. The second trap was the same light, the mesh catching nothing but water as she lifted it. She reset it, moved to the third. Light. The fourth. Light. The rhythm of pulling and resetting, which had been mechanical, became something else by the sixth trap. She was aware now of the weight of the silence on the water, the specific silence of a result that is not arriving, the silence that is not peaceful but expectant in the wrong direction. She stopped the pirogue in the center of the first pond and sat with her hands in her lap. The fog moved around her. Somewhere across the pond, a great blue heron called once, a sound like a piece of sheet metal being bent, and then was quiet. The water was dark and still and gave nothing away. Clara looked at the surface and understood for the first time in a sustained and undefended way that she might have been wrong. Not wrong about Earl, not wrong about the system's theoretical logic, but wrong about this particular ground, this particular season, this particular combination of soil chemistry and water temperature and timing. Wrong in a way that had cost her every dollar she owned plus the truck that had smelled of her grandfather. Wrong in the way that the men at the co-op and Douglas Warren had said she would be wrong, not because they were smart about her specific situation, but because sometimes a prediction made from certainty turns out to be accurate, even when its reasoning is entirely without imagination. She pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth and held it there. Then she picked up the paddle and moved to the seventh trap. It resisted. The resistance was subtle, not the snagging resistance of a trap caught on root debris, which had a sharp, fixed quality, but the live resistance of weight distributed in motion, the trap trying to return to the water as she lifted it from the water, the mesh bowing outward under pressure from inside. She pulled it fully clear of the surface with both hands, and the sound it made was the sound of 100 small bodies in furious motion clicking shells and thrashing appendages, the mesh bulging and alive. The crawfish were deep red, almost burgundy, the color of something that has fed well and grown in the absence of competition. They were larger than anything she had trapped from open water, larger than anything she had seen at the Halma processor's facility, larger than the crawfish she had eaten as a child at her grandmother's table, which had themselves been considered exceptional. She did not have a scale, but she estimated from her time at Sivert Falk's operation that the average specimen in this trap was running close to 4 ounces, nearly double the commercial average. She held the trap over the water for a moment, feeling its weight, and then she set it in the pirogue and sat back down. "All right," she said to no one, to the fog, to the pond that had taken 10 months to say something she could hear. The word came out smaller than she had expected and carried in it, compressed to a single syllable, the full weight of everything she had spent to arrive at this moment. She ran the remaining 33 traps and did not count as she went. She did not trust herself yet to count accurately. When she reached the bank and secured the pirogue, she stood in the shallow water at the pond's edge and looked at what filled the boat and made herself accept carefully that it was real. That first winter harvest across the 3 flooded ponds produced 780 pounds of crawfish. It was not a fortune. Combined with the lean rice earnings, it cleared her property taxes, replenished her pump fuel reserve, and left a margin of approximately $300. She deposited that $300 into an account at the parish bank. Not the bank that had denied her loan, but a smaller institution in the next town that had no history with her. And she looked at it on the deposit slip for a long moment before folding it into the cypress box alongside Earl's notebooks. It was proof. Small proof, but structural proof, the kind that cannot be argued with because it is expressed in the only language that farming communities trust: actual numbers from actual ground. She said nothing about it to anyone. The second season, she flooded 4 ponds instead of 3. The fourth pond, the one with the sandstone substrate that had cost her weeks of levee work, turned out to have a water temperature profile that was consistently 2 degrees warmer than the others, due to the way the limestone shelf beneath the sandstone conducted geothermal warmth, a detail she had not anticipated, and that the crawfish found extremely agreeable. The fourth pond outproduced the first 3 combined in its maiden winter season. She noted this in her notebook without exclamation, the way Earl had taught her as data, as something to understand, not as luck. By 1975, she was farming all 5 natural basins. The rice yields were climbing toward the parish average, which meant the soil was changing, which meant the system was working as a cycle rather than as 2 separate enterprises running simultaneously on the same land. The crawfish had enriched what the rice had begun: the bacterial activity in the water column, altering the clay chemistry over 3 seasons in a way that no fertilizer additive could have produced in 20. She was not adding to the soil. She was restarting the process the soil itself wanted to run. The whispers in town had not disappeared, but they had changed quality. The word fool was being used less often in connection with her name. The word peculiar had appeared, which in this community was nearly a form of respect. Douglas Warren heard the numbers. He did not seek them out, but in a community of this size, the numbers found him. They arrived in the form of conversations at the Rotary Club, in the form of a reference from the grain buyer, who had started listing Clara's rice separately in his ledgers because it was producing at a rate that distorted his averages, in the form of Calhoun Pritt telling a mutual acquaintance at the hardware store without elaboration that the Beaumont woman knew what she was doing. Warren processed the information the way he processed most things that challenged his prior conclusions, by filing them under anomalous and waiting for the pattern to correct itself. The correction he was awaiting for arrived in November of 1978, though not in the form he had expected. The storm that came in from the Gulf that November had no name. It was not a hurricane. It arrived too late in the season for that official designation, but it brought 14 inches of rain in 31 hours and a wind that came in off the open water to the south at sustained speeds that bent the cypress trees at angles Clara had not seen them bend before. She drove out to the property in the middle of the night. She had long since moved from Madame Arsenault's building into a small, simple house she had built on the northeast corner of the property, and she did not need a flashlight to see the problem. The water level in the central basin was visible in the darkness as a pale moving thing, and it was moving over the northern levee. She watched the first levee fail at 2 in the morning, the earthen wall softening and then releasing in a long, slow collapse that sounded less like destruction than like something being set down. The second failed an hour later. The third held until dawn and then failed at its weakest point, a section she had repaired twice, and that she had known privately was not as solid as the others. She stood in the rain and watched the water from the third pond move out across the eastern boundary of the property in a sheet that caught the first gray light and held it briefly before disappearing into the lower ground beyond. The crawfish that season's overwintering crop, the harvest that would have run from December through February, went with the water. She walked the perimeter of the central basin in the morning after the rain stopped the ground soft enough that each step required deliberate effort, the water still draining in thin sheets off the collapsed levees. The financial damage was not abstract to her. She could calculate it precisely because she kept precise records. The projected crawfish yield for the 3 failed ponds was between 3,000 and 3,500 pounds at Sivert Falk's market rate, which translated to approximately $4,000 of gross income. Against that, she had to stack the cost of levee reconstruction, which she estimated at 6 to 7 weeks of work, plus the cost of replacement pump parts damaged when the floodwater had reached the engine housing. The number that emerged from this calculation was the number that erased 4 years of accumulated operating surplus. She was standing in the mud outside the collapsed western levee when she heard a truck on the parish road slow and stop. It was Tolliver Brecht. He rolled down his window and looked at the collapsed levees at Clara, standing in the field at the general evidence of catastrophe, and he said nothing for a moment that went on long enough to constitute a statement in itself. Then, "You need anything, Miss Beaumont?" The offer was genuine, she thought, though it carried within it the specific texture of an offer made to someone you believe has run out of alternatives. "No," she said. "Thank you, Tolliver." He nodded, rolled up his window, drove on. At the co-op that morning, Douglas Warren heard about the damage to the Beaumont property the way he heard most things, through the ordinary commerce of a small community where news travels in the space between one transaction and the next. The man who told him was not being unkind. He simply mentioned it the way weather damage was mentioned as a local fact. Warren thanked him, recorded a note in the margin of his desk calendar, Beaumont levees November flood, and looked at it for a moment before returning to the document in front of him. What he said to the next person who came into his office and mentioned the flood without particular emphasis was, "That system she's running out there, it was always going to be vulnerable to a major weather event. Gumbo ground doesn't hold against serious water." The person he said this to mentioned it to someone else the way these things work, and by afternoon the information circulating through the community had acquired a slight but significant tilt. Warren had said the Beaumont experiment had run its course. He had not said precisely that, but it was close enough to what he had implied that the distinction did not matter to the people who heard it. Clara spent 3 days assessing the damage before she let herself think about reconstruction. This was deliberate. Earl had written in the second notebook about the farmer's reflex of immediate action after disaster, the impulse to start doing things before you understand what the disaster has actually revealed. He had written, "The flood that breaks your levee is the same flood that shows you where your levee was wrong. Fix it in anger and you build the same wrong levee. Wait until you can see what the water was trying to tell you, then build the right one." On the fourth day after the storm, when the ground had dried enough for her to walk the levee lines without losing her boots to the mud, she found what the water had been trying to tell her. The three levees that had failed all shared a characteristic she had not recognized as a problem, because she had not had the context to read it. They ran perpendicular to the natural drainage gradient of the property. They were holding water against the direction the land itself wanted to move it. The two levees that had held the ones on the eastern and southern boundaries ran parallel to the gradient, working with the land's natural inclination rather than against it. She had built 3 of her 5 containment structures in opposition to the physics of the place, and the first serious water event had resolved that contradiction in the most direct way available. She recorded this in her notebook. Then she went to examine the drained pond beds. She had expected to find mud flats, the depressing, featureless expanse of exposed clay that a drained rice field typically reveals when the water leaves. What she found instead stopped her at the edge of the first drained basin, with her notebook open in her hand and nothing in it. The surface of the basin was not flat, it was perforated. Across the entire floor of the pond, wherever the water had stood most consistently through the crawfish season, the surface was riddled with burrow holes, each one roughly the diameter of a thumb. The excavated soil piled in a small cone at the entrance. The way a molehill is piled, the holes themselves descending at slight angles into the substrate. She crouched and put her hand to one, then pushed 2 fingers into the depth the angle allowed. 6 inches. 7. The burrow extended further than her fingers could reach. She pulled her hand out and looked at the clay on her fingers. It was not the pale, compacted clay she had come to know from digging post holes on this property. It was dark, almost black, with a crumble structure that she recognized from Earl's description, the structure of soil that has been worked by biological activity, broken apart and reassembled by the movement of organisms through it, its mineral particles separated from their compressed state into something permeable, something that could hold nutrients instead of repelling them. The crawfish had not left when the levees failed. They had gone down. They had burrowed into the substrate as the water level dropped following the moisture down, and in doing so they had drilled through the layer of impermeable clay that she had been fighting in one form or another since the first planting, the layer that had defeated every row crop Harlan Grice had attempted, the layer that had made this land unsaleable at any reasonable price, the layer that represented in the conventional agricultural assessment of this property the permanent reason it could not be productive. The crawfish had gone through it. Not across it, not around it, through it. Thousands of burrow holes, each one a channel for water and oxygen and biological activity to reach the mineral substrate beneath, turning 6 inches of impermeable hardpan into something that breathed. Clara stood in the empty basin for a long time. The sun was mild and the ground was still damp under her boots, and the burrow holes extended in every direction around her, more of them than she had words to count. She thought about the $4,000 she had lost. She thought about the 6 weeks of levee reconstruction ahead of her. She thought about Douglas Warren's voice carried to her second hand, saying that the experiment had run its course. Then she thought about Earl's line, "What will you have waiting for it when it does?" She had not planned for this. She had planned for a system, and the system had exceeded its own logic in a way she had not designed and could not have designed because the knowledge required to design it did not exist in any agricultural textbook she had found in any library she had visited. The crawfish had done something the literature had not described because no one had built the conditions to observe it. She was the first person who had been stubborn enough and broke enough and guided enough by a dead man's notebooks to create a situation in which a flooded rice field was inhabited by burrowing crawfish for 3 consecutive seasons. She was the only person who had seen what that produced. She walked back to her house, changed her boots, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with her notebook, and spent 3 hours redesigning her levee system from scratch. The reconstruction took 7 weeks rather than 6. She rebuilt every levee on the property, including the 2 that had held, correcting their orientation to align with the drainage gradient she now understood clearly. The new levees were higher, narrower at the top, stepped on their interior faces to slow the absorption of standing water into the earthen core. She drove cypress stakes at shorter intervals than before. She lined the interior faces of the 2 most vulnerable levees with a layer of compacted clay mixed with shredded cypress bark, which she had read about in a 1941 paper on Louisiana levee construction that she had found in the Nickel State Library the previous year and remembered clearly enough to reconstruct from notes. She sold the rice harvest early in the spring of 1979 to cover the reconstruction costs. The margin was thin. The deposit she made in April was smaller than the one she had made in April of the previous year. She looked at the deposit slip, folded it into the cypress box, and did not think about the number as a setback. She thought about it as the cost of a lesson in hydrology and soil mechanics that no agricultural school in Louisiana offered. Roy Fonville arrived in August of 1981 in a white Lincoln Continental that was not built for gravel roads and showed it. He was a broad, deliberate man in his mid-50s who supplied premium seafood to restaurants across New Orleans, and he had heard about Clara Beaumont's crawfish through two intermediate conversations that had each independently used the word extraordinary, a word that Fonville, in his 20 years of the trade, had learned to investigate rather than dismiss. He walked the levees with her for an hour, asking questions that were technically precise, in a way that told her he had done some reading before making the drive. He wanted to know the water temperature profile across the growing season, the stocking density, the feed conversion ratio of rice stubble to crawfish growth, the mineral profile of the bayou water she used as a source. She answered each question directly without embellishment from memory because the numbers lived in her as naturally as geography. At the eastern pond, he asked her to pull a trap. She pulled one. The trap came up heavy in the familiar way, the way that still, after 9 years, produced a small, private satisfaction she did not show in her face. She opened the mesh over the levee bank and let the crawfish fall in a pile. He crouched over them, his continental slacks absorbing mud at the knees without any apparent concern, and he picked one up, turned it, looked at the tail structure, pressed the shell. Then he did something she had not expected. He pulled a small bottle of hot sauce from his breast pocket, twisted the crawfish's tail free with practiced efficiency, peeled it, and put it in his mouth. He chewed slowly. He looked at the remaining pile. He chewed some more. "How much can you supply per season?" The question was unhurried, the voice of a man already doing arithmetic. "Current capacity about 3,500 pounds across the 5 ponds. I have room to expand the system to 8 ponds if the levee work holds. I'll take all of it. 5 ponds, 8 ponds, whatever you can grow." He stood up, wiped his hands on a cloth he produced from the same breast pocket as the hot sauce. "The size and the flavor, that's from the rice stubble feed. The feed contributes. The water chemistry contributes more. This bayou has a mineral profile that works well for the species." He named a price per pound that was 35% above the standard commercial rate. She had known the approximate number he would offer because she had done her research on New Orleans restaurant suppliers. But hearing it said aloud on her own levee bank, in the voice of a man who had driven 3 hours specifically to say it was something different from knowing it abstractly. "That works," she said. They shook hands at the edge of the pond, the crawfish moving in the shallow water around the base of the levee, and the white Lincoln Continental sat on the gravel track behind her house, catching the afternoon sun. And Clara Beaumont was 33 years old, with a premium contract for a product that a man named Douglas Warren had called bugs in a tone of deliberate diminishment 10 years ago. She did not think about Warren then. She thought about Sievert Falk, who had told her the crawfish triple in size when they eat rice rather than common mudgrass, and about the entry in Earl's 7th notebook, where he had copied that same observation from a conversation and written beneath it, "Worth watching." She had watched. 33 years after Earl had written that note, she had built the thing the note was pointing at. Warren did not think about any of this until December of 1983, when the co-op's annual financial review required him to reconcile the member accounts. He did this work himself personally, as he always had, considering it a necessary discipline against the administrative distance that a manager could too easily develop from the actual numbers. He worked through the accounts alphabetically, and when he arrived at Beaumont C, he noted the figures, then looked at them again, then pulled the previous year's file from the cabinet behind his desk and compared them. The profit per acre on the Beaumont operation was higher than any single account in the co-op. Not marginally higher. Not higher in a way that could be attributed to a single good year or a favorable market window. Higher in a way that showed consistent year-over-year growth across 12 seasons, with a brief setback in 1979 that had corrected and then exceeded its prior trajectory within 2 years. He cross-referenced against the Prevost family account, the largest farming operation in the parish. 1,200 acres, the most modern equipment available, a family with 4 generations of agricultural expertise, and the comparison was not close. Per acre, the Beaumont operation was generating nearly twice the net return. He sat with the ledger open on his desk for several minutes. The office was quiet. It was late in the afternoon, the kind of December light that comes in low through west-facing windows and turns everything slightly amber. He was thinking with the specific discomfort of a methodical man confronting a data set that will not resolve into his existing model about a 23-year-old woman who had sat across this desk 12 years ago and described a plan he had dismissed as a child's fantasy. He was not ready yet to go and see her. He did not know exactly what he would say. He closed the ledger, returned it to the cabinet, and sat for another few minutes looking at his hands on the desk before he picked up the next account and continued the review. The thing about being wrong for 12 years is that the knowledge does not arrive all at once. It comes in like water, finding the cracks in impermeable clay, slowly through channels you didn't know were there, until the substrate of what you believe has been quietly entirely replaced by something darker and more alive. He would need 5 more years to admit it out loud. The land, which had never been in any hurry, was not bothered by this. The spring of 1988 arrived early in southern Louisiana, pushing up through the soil in the first week of March with the particular insistence of a season that has waited long enough. Clara's rice fields, 7 ponds now, the expansion funded entirely from crawfish revenue after the Fawnville contract had stabilized her income enough to allow deliberate growth, held their thin layer of pre-planting water with a stillness that made them look from the parish road like a series of mirrors laid flat against the earth. The levees between them were solid, grassed over on their outer faces. The cypress stakes she had driven in 1979 now integrated into the earthen walls so completely that they had become part of the structure rather than reinforcement for it. The land had changed. Anyone who had known the Grice 50 in 1971 and returned to it now would not have immediately recognized it as the same 50 acres. The soil at the water's edge was dark as coffee ground, soft to the foot, giving slightly underweight rather than resisting it. The air above the ponds in the early morning carried the particular richness of active biological systems. Not unpleasant, but dense, layered, the smell of something alive, doing what it is supposed to do. Clara was 40 years old. The change in her was harder to see than the change in the land, which was precisely the way she had arranged it. She was lean in the way that sustained physical work makes a person lean without deliberate effort, the body simply arriving at the shape the labor requires. Her hands were the hands of someone who had been in daily conversation with tools and soil and rope. For 17 years, the palms thick, callous, the fingers stronger than they looked. She wore her hair shorter now than she had in the first years, a practical concession to the heat that she had resisted for longer than was reasonable before making it. The face that looked back from the bathroom mirror each morning carried its 17 years in ways she had stopped accounting for, because the accounting was less interesting than the morning's actual work. The house she had built on the northeast corner of the property in 1976 was small in the way that sufficiency produces smallness, not cramped, but proportioned to need its room size for one person's actual life, rather than a larger life's aspirations. The veranda across the front had been added in 1980 not from vanity, but because she had found herself spending her evenings at a chair dragged to the door, and the veranda was simply the correct architectural response to that behavior. The cypress box sat on a shelf in the main room beside her own notebooks, which now numbered 11 and occupied more linear shelf space than Earl's 24, though they were slimmer individually, being records of a single operation rather than 3 decades of observation across multiple farms. Calhoun Pritt came on the Tuesday morning in the second week of March. She heard his truck on the gravel track before she saw it. She knew his truck by sound now after 17 years of its occasional presence, in the same way she knew the sound of the pump's healthy rhythm versus its slightly labored rhythm when the intake screen needed clearing. He parked behind the house and climbed out with the careful movements of a man who was 67 now rather than 51, who had replaced a hip 2 winters ago, who had farmed his 220 acres longer than almost anyone in the parish, and showed it in the way that long service shows as dignity earned through duration rather than ceremony. He did not knock. He came around to the front of the house where she was sitting on the veranda with her first coffee and the morning's planting notes, and he stood at the bottom of the veranda steps and looked out at the fields the way he always looked at them, with the focused lateral attention of someone reading a text rather than viewing a landscape. After a time, he said, "I've been watching this place since you put the first water in." He did not look at her while he said it. His eyes stayed on the ponds. Earl used to talk about this ground. Not directly, you know how he talked. Sideways. He'd say something about soil patience while we were looking at something else entirely, and you'd realize later he'd been talking about a specific piece of land the whole time. A pause. "I think he always meant this 50 acres. I think he knew it was here before you did." Clara held her coffee with both hands and did not speak because there was nothing to add. Earl would have been proud. He said it simply, without sentiment's excess, the way a man of his generation and his particular temperament stated a thing he considered factually true. Then he looked at her for the first time since he'd arrived. "Some of the men have been asking me about your operation. Not to me personally asking in that way. People ask when they want an answer, but don't want to be seen wanting it. Brecht has driven past this property 3 times in the last month at a speed that isn't going anywhere." "I know," she said. "I've seen him." Calhoun nodded. He had expected that she would have seen him. "The Crawfish numbers from Fonville got around. People compare what you're netting per acre against what they're carrying in debt per acre, and the comparison isn't comfortable for them." He looked back at the fields. "What are you going to do when they come asking directly?" "Tell them," she said. "Same as I'd have told them in 1972 if any of them had asked." He was quiet for a moment. "That's right," he said finally. He looked as though he might add something, then decided the statement was complete. He turned back to his truck, then stopped. "I'll return that pirogue whenever you say the word." "Keep it," Clara said. "It's more useful to have it on your side of the parish." He laughed a short, genuine sound, got back in his truck, backed carefully down the gravel track, was gone. Clara sat with her cooling coffee for a few minutes after the sound of his engine had faded, feeling the weight of what he had said about Earl. Not with grief, but with something that had no clean name. The feeling of being understood by proxy, of being known through the lens of a person who had known you before you had fully known yourself. She was still sitting with it when the state truck appeared at the end of her drive. It came 3 days after Calhoun's visit, the white pickup with the Louisiana Department of Agriculture seal on the door, driven by a field officer named Terrence Mouton, who was 28, recently assigned to the Basin District, carrying a clipboard with a form on it that he had already explained to her by phone the previous week. A routine environmental compliance survey, he had said. Water quality assessment standard for all operations drawing from the Bayou system. She had said she understood, and she did understand. The survey was indeed routine, the result of an expanded federal monitoring program that required the state to assess agricultural water discharge in sensitive bayou-adjacent zones. It was not aimed at her specifically. She knew this. She had also prepared for it completely because preparation was how she approached every official interaction with her operation. Mouton spent 4 hours on the property. He pulled water samples from the intake at the bayou pump from 3 locations across the pond system, from the discharge point where the overflow from her fields re-entered the drainage system that eventually fed back to the bayou. He tested pH, turbidity, dissolved oxygen, nitrate levels, phosphorus, concentration, coliform bacteria count. He was professional, methodical, and slightly surprised. She could see the surprise accumulating in his expression as the morning progressed by the organization of her records, which she laid out on the kitchen table when he asked for them. 17 years of water test results she had conducted herself with a field chemistry kit purchased in 1973 from a biological supply company in Baton Rouge. The data entered in columns with dates and weather conditions and notes on any anomalies she had observed. He sat at her kitchen table for 20 minutes reviewing the records with the focused attention of someone who was finding something he had not expected to find. When he left, he told her the formal results would take 4 to 6 weeks. The formal results arrived in 5. She read the document standing at her mailbox, squinting slightly against the morning sun, turning pages with fingers that carried the remnant mud of the early trap running. The language was technical in the specific way that regulatory documents are technical, dense with qualification hedged with the vocabulary of scientific caution, but the conclusion was not ambiguous. Her discharge water tested cleaner than her intake water across every measured parameter. The pond system she had built was not simply neutral in its environmental impact. It was a net positive. The biological activity of the integrated rice crawfish system was filtering the bayou water that passed through it, stripping excess nutrients, supporting oxygen levels, creating habitat for native aquatic species. The operation was producing an environmental benefit that no one, not Mouton, not the department, not Clara herself, though she had suspected something in this direction from her own testing, had formally quantified before. She read the document twice, folded it, and put it in the Cypress box beside Earl's notebooks. She did not immediately tell anyone. She was not being strategic. She simply did not have, in the first days after the report arrived, a clear sense of what telling would mean or who needed to know. The information felt private in the way that personal vindication feels private, not something to be kept from the world, but something to be held quietly for a little while before it is released into the world's noise. Douglas Warren learned about the report before she told him. This was not surprising. The State Environmental Office had a standard protocol of notifying the local agricultural cooperative when compliance results were issued for member operations, and the form arrived on Warren's desk on the same day Clara received her copy. He read it with the particular stillness of someone receiving information that requires adjustment. The report confirmed what his own co-op ledgers had been trying to tell him for 5 years, that the Beaumont operation was not only profitable, but structurally sound in ways his initial assessment had not accounted for. The environmental data added a dimension his financial data had not contained. The system was regenerative in a way that conventional agriculture in the parish was demonstrably not. He put the report in the folder. He put the folder in his desk drawer. He opened it again on each of the 3 following mornings, read a different section, closed it. On the 4th morning, he picked up his phone and then put it down. He was not at 61, a man who found it easy to be in a position that required him to say something he had spent 17 years not saying. He was not a man who had spent much of his professional life acknowledging the limits of his own certainty. It was not cowardice. It was the specific difficulty of a person who has built his identity around reliable judgment, discovering a case in which his judgment had failed completely at cost to another person over a period long enough to have mattered. He drove out on a Thursday in May. The sedan moved down Clara's gravel track with a caution that broadcast its unfamiliarity with unpaved surfaces. She was at the eastern pond when she heard it running the morning trap line, the pirogue tied to the levee stake while she worked. She came around the side of the house, still carrying the trap-running gloves, still wearing the rubber overalls she wore for the wet work, to find Warren standing at the edge of the gravel where it met the grass, his shoes making a visible decision about the transition. He had aged in the years since their single meeting in his office. He was heavier. His hair fully gray now, his bearing carrying the slight compression of a man who has been behind a desk long enough that the desk has begun to shape him. He held his hat in both hands. She stopped a few feet away and waited. She had practiced nothing for this. There was nothing to practice. She had known with the flat certainty of someone who has earned it that this moment would arrive. The form it took had been less predictable than the fact of it. "I've been looking at your numbers for 5 years," Warren said. He looked at the fields while he said it, then brought his eyes to her. "I've been looking at that environmental report for 2 weeks. I've been trying to find a way to account for what you've built out here that doesn't require me to sit in front of you and say the thing I owe you." He turned the hat in his hands. "I owe you the thing anyway." Clara waited. "I was wrong." 3 words stated without qualification or self-protective clause. "I was wrong about this land. I was wrong about your plan. I was wrong about you." He held her eyes. "I told you in 1971 that what you were describing was a child's fantasy, and I said it with the confidence of someone who believed he understood what this land was capable of. I didn't understand it. I understood what had been tried on it and what had failed, and I mistook that for understanding the land itself." He stopped. His hands had gone still on the hat. "I'm sorry, Clara, for the denial and for what I said afterward when the levees failed. That was not right." The silence between them held for a moment. The ponds caught the morning light in long silver panels. A heron moved across the eastern pond in its slow, deliberate way, landing on the levee with the precision of long habit. "You were stating what you knew. Clara said. Her voice was level, the voice of someone who has thought about this moment carefully and arrived at a position that is not performance. What you knew was limited. That's not the same as being wrong on purpose. He looked as though this was not the response he had fully prepared for. It's kind of you to say that. It isn't kindness, she said. It's what I think. There's a difference. She looked out at the ponds. You came from 19 years of watching one kind of farming work on this kind of land. My grandfather came from 30 years of watching what the land would do if you stopped telling it what to be. You didn't have his 30 years. You had what you had. She paused. The credit line you offered at the end, that was genuine. I know that. At the end of their meeting in his office 17 years ago, he had told her that if she ever needed credit for anything, she could come see him. He had said it as the closest thing to an apology he had been capable of at the time. She had understood it as such, then had carried it as such since. I don't need it now, she said. I haven't needed it since about 1980. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the near neighbor of one. I know. He looked at the fields one more time, the comprehensive, measuring look of someone in his profession, seeing a result he cannot fully categorize. The environmental report, the board is going to want to discuss it. There are implications for the whole co-op district about soil management practices, about what's possible in the bayou-adjacent parcels that members have been treating as marginal. He paused. I'd like to send some people out here. Farmers who might be asking the right questions if they have something concrete to look at. Send them, Clara said. I'll talk to anyone who wants to understand the system. He put his hat back on. He looked at her, a final direct look that had in it the acknowledgement of something that could not be entirely articulated, the look of a man who has driven a long way to say something difficult, and is feeling now that it said the particular exhaustion and relief of that. Then he walked back to his sedan, got in, carefully reversed down the gravel track with the same caution he had arrived with, and was gone. Clara stood in the yard for a while after the sound of his engine faded. Not because she needed to stand there, but because the moment seemed to require some acknowledgement beyond simply moving on to the next task. 17 years was not nothing. The weight of it, the specific sustained pressure of working against a community's collective certainty for 17 consecutive years was not something she had fully allowed herself to feel while it was ongoing, because feeling it would have made the work harder to sustain. She had kept it stored somewhere behind the practical requirements of each season, each levee repair, each early morning on the pirogue in the fog. She allowed herself to feel some portion of it, now standing in the yard, with the ponds extending behind her and the morning warming around her. Not triumph. Triumph was for people who had been in a contest, and she had never experienced this as a contest. What she felt was simpler than that, though harder to name, the feeling of something that had been held open for a long time finally closing. A parenthesis, 17 years wide. Then she went inside, poured herself a second coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the cypress box. She had not intended to open it. She had opened the box hundreds of times over the years to add documents, to reference Earl's notebooks for specific data, to read a particular passage she was trying to remember accurately. This time she opened it without a specific purpose, which was unusual for her, and lifted Earl's notebooks out until she reached the fourth one from the bottom, the drought journal with the cracked brown cover. She knew the passages she was looking for. She had read them enough times that she could find the pages by the texture of the paper at the bookmark rather than by page number. She read the passage she had always read, the one about the cracked ponds, the vessel, the purpose of being filled. Then she turned the page the way she had on the night before she put the first water into the first basin and read Earl's lines about the man who sells broken land. The man who sells you broken land is not your enemy. He simply could not hear what you will hear. She had read that passage a dozen times since 1971 and had understood it each time as being about Harlan Grice. Harlan had been its obvious referent, the man who had laughed driving away the man who could not hear what she could hear in the clay beneath her palms. She turned the page again past the spot where she had always stopped. There were two more lines. She had never read past the passage about Harlan because she had found what she was looking for and closed the notebook, had done so every time for 17 years, and had therefore never reached the two lines that followed it. Earl's handwriting continued on the next line, slightly smaller, as though he had added it later in a different sitting. The man who tells you that you cannot is not your enemy either. He is simply the next man who needs to hear the thing you already know. Be patient with him the way the land is patient with you. She read it twice. She set the notebook flat on the table in front of her, her hands resting on either side of it, and looked at the words. Earl had written that in 1971. No, she looked at the date at the top of the entry, something she almost never checked because she knew the notebook's chronology well enough. The date was August 1953. Earl had written those words 18 years before Clara had bought the Grice 50, before she had met Douglas Warren, before she had sat in his office and heard the word bugs used as a diminishment. He had written it about something else entirely, something in his own life that his notebooks never directly named, and he had left it there for her to find when she was ready, which was apparently today, in her 41st year, on the morning after the man he had described had driven down her gravel track and done the difficult thing. The ponds outside were bright in the late morning sun. The pump ran its steady rhythm. The trap lines she had not finished running were still out there, floats bobbing slightly in the minimal surface movement of the eastern pond, waiting for her return. She closed the notebook, returned it to the box, latched the brass hook, put the box back on its shelf. The farmers started coming in June. Warren had sent word through the co-op newsletter, a single paragraph about the state environmental report, a factual summary of the Beaumont operations results, an open invitation to members interested in discussing integrated rice crawfish production to contact the co-op office for arrangements. Clara had approved the language in the newsletter before it went out, which Warren had asked her to do. She had made two small changes, both of which removed superlatives and replaced them with numbers. They came in ones and twos, mostly pulling into her gravel track on Saturday mornings or on weekday afternoons when the previous day's work was done. Tolliver Brecht came on the third Saturday of June alone, arriving earlier than his scheduled time and sitting in his truck at the end of the drive for 15 minutes. Before coming to the door, she had seen him from the kitchen window and waited until he knocked, rather than going out to save him the walk, because she understood that the walk was part of what this visit required of him. He was 64 now, his face more deeply mapped than it had been in the years when he had assessed her failure at Delphine's over morning coffee. He sat on the veranda with her for 2 hours, asking questions that were specific, practical, grounded in the experience of someone who had farmed seriously for 4 decades. He did not reference anything he had said in the early years. She did not reference it either. They talked about water management and soil chemistry, and the logistics of transitioning a conventional rice operation to a dual production system, the startup costs, the first-year risks, the seasonal labor requirements. When he left, he shook her hand at the bottom of the veranda steps, a formal gesture that meant more in the context than it would have in any other, and told her he would be back with his son. He came back the following Saturday with his son. Calhoun Pritt brought 3 men from the western end of the parish on a Tuesday morning and stood at the edge of the ponds while Clara talked, contributing nothing to the conversation except occasional nods that meant he was confirming what she was saying against his own observation of the operation over the years. His presence was its own form of endorsement, the most reliable form available in this community, and the 3 men he had brought understood that asking their questions with more seriousness than they might have without him there. The younger farmers were the most direct. A man named Wheeler Fontenot, 32 farming land his grandfather had broken, came with a yellow legal pad and filled 4 pages. He asked about the specific rice varieties she used, the crawfish species, the water temperature management in summer versus winter, the trap spacing, the bait rotation. He asked about her record-keeping system, and she showed him one of her own notebooks, not Earl's, but her own, sitting with him at the kitchen table while he copied the column structure into his legal pad. He left with more specific information than anyone else who came, because he asked for more specific information than anyone else who came. She liked this about him. She did not think of what she was doing as teaching. Earl had not thought of it as teaching when he had done it with her. It was closer to the thing that a person does when they have learned something by hard means, and someone asks them how you tell them fully, because withholding would be a kind of poverty you are not willing to carry. You tell them and they take what fits their situation and leave the rest the way you had taken what fit from Earl's notebooks and left the parts that applied to different ground, different conditions, different years. By the following spring, 3 operations in the parish had begun the transition. By 1991, the number was 11. By 1993, the co-op newsletter ran its first comprehensive article on integrated rice crawfish production as a standard regional practice, and the article did not mention Clara Beaumont by name. It mentioned her as a regional pioneer, a characterization that was accurate in every detail, while missing the specific texture of what the pioneering had actually felt like. The bare bulb, the empty traps, the levees failing in the November dark, the truck keys handed to a man who drove it away down a street she had watched without letting herself run after it. She expanded to 8 ponds in 1990, as she had told Fonville she planned to. The eighth pond developed on what had been a particularly difficult corner of the property. Low, difficult to drain, prone to a specific soil condition she had taken 2 seasons to fully understand and address, became by its third production year the highest yielding pond on the operation. This was not surprising to her. It was consistent with what Earl had written and what 17 years of her own observation had confirmed: the most difficult ground properly understood was almost always the most productive, because the conditions that made it difficult were the same conditions that correctly managed made it exceptional. She did not expand beyond 8 ponds. The decision was not financial. She could have supported 12, could have bought the adjacent parcel from the widow of a retired schoolteacher in Houma who was trying to sell it, could have scaled the operation in ways that the Fonville contract would have rewarded substantially. She had thought about it carefully and concluded that 8 ponds were the size at which she could know every part of the system. Personally, could walk every levee in a morning, could pull representative trap samples from each pond in an afternoon. Beyond that size, management became administrative rather than observational. She was not an administrator. She was a listener. Earl's word, adopted and held. The operation at 8 ponds generated in its best years a net return that Clara calculated to be approximately what Randall Dempsey netted from his 200 acres with a full equipment complement. She had done this on 50 without debt, without a combine, without the fertilizer inputs that Randall's land required in increasing quantities every year to maintain yields that were slowly declining as the soil exhausted itself. She was not in competition with Randall. She never thought of it that way. But the comparison was available, and she made it occasionally, not with satisfaction at his difficulty, but with a kind of clarity about what she had built and what it had required. She heard from him once in all those years, a handwritten note sent through a mutual acquaintance in 1985, brief and without explanation, that said, "I heard about your operation. Father always said Earl Beaumont knew something the rest of us didn't." He was right. She had read it twice, put it in her desk, not in the cypress box. Some things belonged in the record. Some things were just information. The summer her niece Delia's daughter turned 9, Clara found herself thinking about the cypress box in a new way. The child, whose name was Rosalind, which she had chosen herself at age 4 from a list her parents had offered her, and which had delighted Earl's spirit and Clara so completely that she had told the story at every occasion available, was spending the month of July with Clara, while her parents managed a complicated situation that Clara did not inquire into. Rosalind was the kind of child who moved through the world at an angle to the expected, asking questions that were always slightly adjacent to the obvious question and therefore more interesting. She had arrived with 2 suitcases and a notebook with a green cover that she called her science book, into which she had been recording observations since age 7, with a seriousness that Clara recognized without commenting on. Rosalind spent the first week following Clara on the morning trap runs, silent and attentive, in the pirogue, watching the trap-pulling procedure with the focused quality of someone memorizing a process. On the 8th morning, she asked, "When do you know a trap is going to be heavy before you pull it?" Clara looked at her across the pirogue. "There's a particular way the float sits in the water," she said. "When the trap below is full, the weight pulls the line at a specific angle. You learn to read the angle." Rosalind looked at the nearest float, adjusted something in her expression, and did not speak again until they were back at the bank. Then she said, "The third float from the left is sitting differently from the others." Clara looked. The child was correct. On a Sunday evening in late July, Clara took the cypress box from its shelf. Rosalind was sitting at the kitchen table with her green notebook. Clara set the box on the table between them and unlatched the brass hook. She did not intend it as a ceremony. She had no prepared words, no planned structure. She simply lifted out the drought journal, the fourth from the bottom, the one she had most often carried with her in her reading life, and opened it to the page she knew best. She set it in front of Rosalind and said, "This was my grandfather's. He wrote it in 1934. Rosalind looked at the spidery, right-slanting script with the expression of someone encountering a new language and measuring the distance between where they are and the ability to read it. What does it say? Clara pointed to the line she had read at 17 and not understood, had read at 23 and understood partially, had read at 40 and understood fully. A vessel is only a vessel. Its purpose is to be filled. She read it aloud slowly. Rosalind considered this. She looked out the kitchen window at the ponds, which were catching the last of the July light in long orange panels. She looked back at the notebook. Was he talking about the ponds? He was talking about the ponds, Clara said. He was talking about the land. He was also talking about something else, and I'm not entirely certain what. People too, maybe, Rosalind said. Clara looked at her niece's daughter with her green notebook and her 9 years of attention to the world around her, and felt the specific wordless quality of something being passed from one set of hands to another. Not given exactly because the thing could not be given outright. It could only be pointed at the way Earl had pointed at the hackberry tree with the watermarks on its trunk, the way he had asked not what she saw, but what she thought about what she saw. Maybe people too, Clara said. Rosalind reached out and turned the page carefully, the way she had watched Clara turn the pages of the notebooks on previous evenings. She looked at the next entry, the spidery script, the columns of rainfall data, alongside observations about root structure and insect behavior. Her finger traced a line of text without touching it, hovering just above the paper. Can you teach me to read his handwriting? Yes, Clara said. It takes practice. The letters lean hard to the right like they're always walking into a wind. She reached across and pointed to a word. That's soil. That one is patience. Those two show up together more than any other words he wrote. Outside, the pump cycled down for the evening with its familiar deceleration, the diesel rhythm slowing and then settling into silence. The ponds going quiet in the way they went quiet each night. Not empty, not still in any dead sense, but resting. Doing in darkness. What they did in daylight, the biological work continuing below the surface at the patient-independent rate that did not require observation to sustain itself. The heron that had taken up residence on the eastern levee called once somewhere out in the settling dark and was answered by something further in the cypress line. The land was doing what it had always done, what it had wanted to do before anyone asked it to do. Otherwise, what it had spent 17 years teaching a 23-year-old woman in the slow, specific language of seasons and yields and the weight of traps pulled from cold water before dawn. It would keep doing it after her. It had been doing it in its patient, impersonal way before her. The 50 acres that a man had laughed about driving away from that, an institution had called a child's fantasy, that a community had filed under lost causes and moved on the 50 acres were not making a statement. They did not have a point to prove. They were simply being what they had always been, which was what everything eventually becomes when someone stops fighting it and starts listening. Rosalind turned another page. The lamp above the kitchen table was warm, the notebook spread between them, the evening outside the window, thick with the sounds of a living system doing its quiet, necessary work. And in the cypress box between them lay 24 notebooks that a man had filled over 31 years, pointing at this exact moment without knowing its details, trusting that the person who needed it would find her way to it when she was ready. The way water finds the level it was always going to find, the way a vessel given time fills.